Okay, hello everybody. Good to see you all back again. And as always, hope you're going to enjoy today's session. This is the last of our Zoom meetings until September. Now all these dates are on the website, but I'll tell you them anyway in case you want to write them down. So we're back here on the 7th of September. Then we have no Zoom meeting in October because on the 18th we've got our one-day conference in Gloucester, and that's on archives. Again, look at the website for the full details, but we've still got the call for papers out if anybody wants to say anything about archives. And don't forget that you can offer us a recording. If you can't be there on the day, we can't necessarily beam you in live, but we can certainly play a pre-recorded piece. So that's 18th of October. That'll be then back to the Zoom meetings, 9th of November and 7th of December. And that will finish off this year's programs. And then for next year, the only thing we've got booked at the moment is the 18th of April in Manchester at the Portico Library. So we're coming up in the world. And the topic for that is women and song, women in song, women hyphen song, and so on. Everything to do with women and songs. The actual call for papers I don't think is out yet, but it will be soon. If it's not yet, I can't remember. So we have two presentations for you.
Sorry, Steve, can I just ask, that 9th of November clashes with the FTSS conference in London?
In which case it shouldn't be that. Oh, hang on a minute. All right, so it might not be the 9th of November. Look on the website, people. We've got time enough to change that one. Thank you, Derek. Okay, to today's session, we have two very interesting papers, and we're going to start with Andy on Cecil Sharp. He's here somewhere. He's still there. Yes. So over to you, Andy.
Okay, here we go.
That's good.
Right. Last month, I talked about my Kent Trad website, which is concerned with songs and singers from Kent. This time I'm going to look specifically at Cecil Sharp's collecting activities in Kent. These divide, there we go. These divide into four distinct episodes between 1908 and 1914. I'll take them in chronological order, but I'll be focusing on the two in the middle there when he visited Ham Street. On his first trip in July 1908, he collected half a dozen singing children's games at the school at Trosley in the west of Kent between Maidstone and Sevenoaks. Sharp wrote it as Trosley, but the more usual modern spelling is Trottiscliffe, but as far as I know, pronounced Trosley. For each game, he noted the tune, if there was one, the words, and the actions. A few months later, he was back in Kent for 2 days collecting songs in the adjoining villages of Warehorn, Ham Street and Ruckinge, which are just to the north of Romney Marsh. Here's a more detailed view. You can see that they're very close together, with the land dipping down slightly to the south, and south of that is to the Royal Military Canal to the south, and south of that is Romney Marsh. It would have been an easy train journey for Sharp, probably from Charing Cross down to Ashford, and then he would have taken the line towards Hastings, and Ham Street in Orliston is the first stop, and was the first stop then. This photograph is not the adoring crowds that turned out to welcome Cecil Sharp's arrival in Ham Street, but it shows the Empire Day celebrations earlier that summer. It's taken right in the middle of the village, and the signpost again shows how close the other villages are. There's a railway bridge at the back of the photo, and the station is just the other side of that bridge. so you can imagine Sharp cycling down that hill. Possibly he stayed with someone he knew in the area. Otherwise, he most likely took lodgings at the Duke's Head Hotel, which is just out of shot in the bottom right of this photo. Sharp's visit to Kent coincided with the start of a new field notebook, Volume 7, and the first page of the notebook has got these notes which I've spent some time trying to decipher with only partial success. I'm not sure what this says. Possibly Mr. George Terry Tranby, brackets farmer. I've not been able to trace anyone with any variation of this name that I've yet thought of, but I'm sure there are other possibilities that I haven't yet thought of. Next, the County Members Inn at Lymm. That's 8 miles away. The pub's still there, and it was perhaps recommended as somewhere that Sharp would find singers. Tom Hudson on stays, on stops, not sure. Lodged with Malem. I've no idea about Tom Hudson. I've not found a Thomas Hudson living locally. Census records do identify a number of people called Malem. For instance, Frank Malem, a farmer and fruit grower who lived at Home Farm, Ham Street, or John Malem, a poultry dealer, originally from Warehorn, who now lived at Lymm Corner. Does Sharp mean that Tom Hudson lodged with Malem, as an agricultural labourer perhaps? I assume it doesn't mean that Sharp himself lodged with Malem, but who knows? I did initially wonder if this might be the antiquarian Percy Malem, who wrote a book about the Kentish Hood and Horse, but I'm not sure that Sharp and that Malem were acquainted, and in any case it wouldn't make any sense to collect songs in the Ham Street area while staying with Percy Malem in Canterbury. There would have been plenty of villages closer to Canterbury where Sharp might have found singers and songs. Carrying on, we get to Blackman and Tom Tipples, brackets, Mr. T Major. Again, there's no obvious candidate for this Mr. Major. Blackman and Tom Tipples might have been songs in his repertoire, possibly. We're on to safer grounds with the next two. Higgins, brackets, 84, Aldington. This would almost certainly have been Alfred Higgins, an agricultural labourer, born in 1824 at Bonington, and then living at Aldington. Both of these are villages just a few miles away. Charlie Balding, cherry picker. Balding or Balden is a very common surname locally. Thanks to David Balding, who runs a family website, we can identify this person as the Charlie Balding, 1848 to 1929, who lived at Cherry Gardens, Bonington, hence his nickname of cherry picker. This is a different Charles Balding to the one whose version of Come All You Little Streamers was sent to Francis Collinson in the 1940s and was performed on the Country Magazine radio programme. Finally, I think this says night night, presumably just Sharp signing off for the night before getting into bed. But if anyone would care to take a closer look at this page on the VWML site and is able to make more sense of Sharp's handwriting than I have, please get in touch. I'll put a link to the page in the chat later on. In short, what I think we have here is a tantalising list of possible singers that Cecil Sharp never met. Let's now look at those he did meet. I suggested earlier that Sharp may have lodged at the Duke's Head. He almost certainly visited the pub, as on the 22nd of September, he collected one song from the landlord, Clark Lonkhurst. And this is apparently the Lonkhurst family standing outside the hotel. In the VWML archive catalogue, the singer's name has been transcribed as Clark Lankhurst, but I think that's an error in interpreting Sharp's handwriting rather than an error by Sharp himself. When I first came across the name in the early 80s, I was pretty sure that it was Lonkhurst, not Lankhurst. And I wondered if we were related, as some of my ancestors were Longhursts, who came from Romney Marsh. It seems that in the 19th century, the name was rendered fairly indiscriminately as Longhurst or Lonkhurst. In fact, this singer's baptism record has him as Clark Longhurst. One of my great-grandmothers was Caroline Longhurst, and it turns out that her grandfather and Clark Lonkhurst's grandfather were brothers. I think that makes us first cousins 7 times removed. Not exactly close, but it will have to do to establish my credentials as a traditional singer. Longhurst had lived in Ham Street most of his life, working as an agricultural labourer and then as a carrier. He married the daughter of a publican, and he too moved into the licensed victualling trade, first running the Blue Anchor Inn at nearby Ruckinge, then moving further afield to run a pub at Dunkirk between Faversham and Canterbury, and finally returning to Ham Street in 1906 or 1907. He remained landlord of the Duke's Head until his death in August 1926. Actually, referring to him as landlord is perhaps not to do him justice. When his daughter Queenie was married in April 1922, his occupation was given as hotel proprietor, and at the time of the 1911 census, not only were his wife and daughter assisting in the business, but they also employed a domestic help and an ostler. David Sutcliffe notes that when he died, Longhurst left £1,746, the equivalent of 107,000 today. And as you can see, the family were able to afford a fairly substantial headstone in the parish church of St Mary the Virgin at Orliston. Just to clarify, Ham Street is in the parish of Orliston, but Orliston itself is actually just a hamlet, and the pretty little church is about 1 mile outside the much larger village of Ham Street. I often wonder, when only one song has been collected from a singer, why that is. Perhaps he only knew one song, but that seems unlikely. More likely it was the only one which met Sharp's criteria of what a folk song was. Or, perhaps, as landlord of a pub, he was simply too busy to spend much time singing songs to this total stranger. In any case, here is his song, a version of Round 19, Nobleman and Thresherman, and about 4 verses were noted down as well. On the same day, Sharp collected a version of the Barley Mow from George Benstead. It's a drinking song. Perhaps he was in the Duke's Head and this suggested the song to him, or, well, this is pure speculation. David Sutcliffe has identified the singer as an agricultural labourer, Percy George Benstead, born in 1882, so only 26 when he met Sharp. Sharp normally gives a singer's age in brackets after his name. In Benstead's case, there is a squiggle, which could be the letter Y, standing for young, perhaps. The following day, 23rd of September, Sharp appears to have started off by going to Ruckinge, where he noted 2 songs from 81-year-old Charles Barling. 2 verses, one rather fragmentary of Kind Sir, I Am Too Young, and just the tune for Lord Thomas and Fair Eleanor. It may be that Mr. Barling sang a fairly standard set of words for Lord Thomas and Fair Eleanor, so Sharp didn't write them down, or he may simply have forgotten the words. The 23rd of September was also when he met James Beale, who sang him 8 songs. He found Beale working at Warehorn, although his family lived on the Ruckinge Road, Ham Street. We know a little about James Beale because Peter Kennedy and Maud Carpleys visited his son Albert in January 1954 and recorded him talking about his family background, as well as singing a few songs. In 1983, I met Albert's son Charles, who gave me information about his father but would barely have known his grandfather. He said the story within the family was that the Beales had been caravan dwellers from Sussex who settled in the Ham Street area. Certainly James Beale was born in Sussex at Wivelsfield, but I've not found any evidence that his family were travellers. In the 1841 census, James's father was a railway labourer, almost certainly employed in the construction of the first railway line from London to Brighton, which was completed in September 1841 and ran close to Wivelsfield. But by 1851, the family were paupers, residents of the workhouse at Ringmer. James clearly managed to work his way out of the workhouse and ended up in Ham Street. He married a local woman in Orliston Church in July 1860, and they remained in the area, raising 9 children. James worked as an agricultural labourer, as a wood dealer, as a fruiterer, if I'm reading the census enumerator's handwriting correctly, and as a poulterer. When taken to court in 1889, probably over an unpaid debt. He was described as a higgler. The OED defines a higgler as an itinerant dealer, especially a carrier or a huckster, who buys up poultry and dairy produce and supplies in exchange petty commodities from the shops in town. Among James Beale's songs are a really nice 5/4 version of The Bold Fisherman, shown here, and also a rarely collected song with links to Freemasonry, Sons of Levi. Cecil Sharp included this song in his English Folk Carols 1911, with the following note: sung by Mr. James Beale and Mrs. Harding at Ham Street. Mrs. Harding was one of James Beale's daughters, and we'll come to her in just a moment. Sharp wrote, "The words are obviously very corrupt. The first and the last two stanzas in the text are substantially as they were sung to me, but it has been necessary to make some small alterations in the other two stanzas. In making these changes, I have been guided by a broadside version of the song, printed by J. Nicholson of Belfast, which, however, in some places is almost as unintelligible as the Ham Street version. This carol is, and has been for many years, annually sung at Christmas in Ham Street and the neighbouring villages by a party of male carol singers. I've not found or heard of it elsewhere, nor can I connect the air, which is a strong one, with any other English folk tune. It is indeed a particularly fine tune, almost worth singing in spite of the fact that the words really don't make a great deal of sense. You wouldn't really class it as a carol, definitely not a Christmas carol, but the Beale family were far from the only people who sang non-Christmassy material when they went out carolling at Christmas. Sharp returned to Ham Street on the 11th of October 1911, and he noted 3 songs from James Beale's daughter, Alice, then 41 years old. She had married in 1893 and was now Mrs. Harden. That's Harden, not Harding, as Sharp wrote it down. At some point between 1901 and 1911, she and her husband had moved to Newbury Farm, Tong, which is near Sittingbourne, where David Harden, her husband, took up the post of farm bailiff. Sharp's visit must have very nearly coincided with her father's death. He was buried at Orliston Church less than a week later on the 17th of October. We don't know, of course, whether Alice Harden found singing a few songs for Sharp a welcome distraction, or frankly, a pain that she could have done without. Whatever, Sharp noted 3 carols from her, all of which presumably were part of the family's Christmas carolling repertoire. And even if it was just the males of the family who went out singing at Christmas, clearly these songs were known by other members of the family. Sharp took down a fairly standard version of As I Sat on a Sunny Bank and the 7 Joys of Mary, and also The Moon Shines Bright, which he'd already noted from her father, and later in the 1950s would be recorded from her brother Albert Beale. As we've seen, although he doesn't appear to have actually noted the song down from her on paper, Sharp also recorded that Alice Harden sang the songs Sons of Levi. Let's now take a quick look at Sharp's final recording activity in Kent. This was at Belvedere between Abbey Wood and Erith in 1914. The map I'm using here shows modern local authority boundaries, which is why Belvedere is very nearly off the map. Historically part of Kent, since 1965 it has formed part of the London Borough of Bexley. Belvedere House had been opened on New Year's Day 1876. It was run by the Royal Alfred Seafarers Society as a home for worn-out and disabled merchant seamen. And here are some of the residents making the most of their weekly tobacco rations. Sharp had written to the governor of the home back in 1908, but was told, "I regret very much to say that I have no singing men in my crew. I have asked them times out a number to try, but they have no voice left in them. Therefore, it would only be waste of time and expense to you to come." However, Sharp must have been persistent, as another letter a week later began, "You are at liberty to come to the home and do the best you can." If he did visit in 1908, he must have found that the governor was correct about not having anyone who could sing. But he made 2 visits in September 1914, and collected over a dozen shanties from Bob Ellison. Two of these, Shallow Brown and Woe Stormalong, were included in Sharp's English folk chanties of 1914. Sharp recorded that Mr. Ellison was 78 years old, but other than that we know nothing about him. We have no idea where he might have lived prior to entering the home, and presumably that could have been pretty much anywhere in the country, not necessarily the southeast. The 1911 census return, so 3 years earlier, for the Royal Alfred, lists an Augustus Ellison, 73 years old, unmarried, and born in Durham, Norton-on-Hill. Possibly this is our shanty singer, but I've not actually been able to trace any earlier record of him as either Augustus or Bob or Robert. But when Augustus Ellison died in 1916, his age was given as 80, and that puts his birth year as 1836, which tallies with Bob Ellison's age when Sharp met him. In any case, we do have some small insight into Mr. Ellison's character. Sharp's notes for the shanty Shanidar quote the singer as saying, "I am nice and comfortable here, but I'm afraid they will want to bury me in a churchyard. I would rather be buried on the high seas on a dirty wild night than in Westminster Abbey." James Madison Carpenter also visited the Royal Alfred home in 1928 and made several recordings of shanties and other songs from the residents. You can see his notes and hear the recordings on the VWML website. The home still exists, although it moved to near Banstead in Surrey in 1978. Finally, a postscript. Last month, when talking about the Kentrad website, I quoted Francis Collinson, who complained about the dearth of songs noted in Kent by the early collectors. He claimed that Cecil Sharp, the most assiduous collector of all, had noted only one song from a Kentish source, and that one he heard from a Kentish man resident in the west of England. Now, I think I've tracked down what Collinson was referring to, and actually he got the wrong end of the stick. In the 1905 journal, Sharp contributed an article, "Folk Songs Noted in Somerset and North Devon," and this included a version of Polly Vaughan under the title "The Setting of the Sun." And by way of comparison, he also included a version which had been sung in Kent. Sharp got this version from Clarence Rooke, who had heard it sung 20 years ago by a very old man at a harvest supper at Homestall, Doddington. That's near Rooke's hometown of Faversham. His father had been postmaster in the town. Readers of the journal would probably have known Rooke's name, as he was a successful journalist and author, writing a popular column for the Daily Chronicle. In 1901, having read about a night shooting accident in Essex, the song "The Setting of the Sun," or Polly Vaughan, whatever you want to call it, had come to mind, and he had appealed to readers of the Daily Chronicle and then subsequently the Faversham Mercury to see if they could provide him with more than the 2 verses that he could recall. It would appear that this appeal was unsuccessful. I don't see any follow-up correspondence in the Faversham Mercury, and Sharp was only able to take down 2 verses from him. And just for once, I have to say I agree with the rather dismissive comment that it's a dismal melody. It's a very short melody, and it is rather dismal and monotonous, which is another word that he ran that Rooke used elsewhere. It's a shame there's not a bit more of it. Anyway, that concludes this month's presentation. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Andy. That was excellent. Yeah. Of course, Sharp isn't known, is he, for his visits to Kent? So it's good to know, that he did escape from Somerset occasionally.
Just occasionally, yes.
Yeah. Sue Allen is asking in the chat, is it Ham Street all one word, or is it Ham Street 2 words?
Yes. I think currently it's more likely to be spelt as one word, but I wouldn't like to, even though I was only brought up about 8 miles away, I wouldn't like to say which is correct, and historically it could be either.
Right, okay. So yes, both is the answer.
And when searching for it, for instance, in Find My Past, search for Orliston because that was the parish name, even though it was a tuppenny halfpenny place that had a church and nothing else.
And also that, I mean, you flagged this, you flagged up what everybody flags up, especially with Sharp, is the spelling of the people's names, the singers' names, is variable to say the least. And we tend to sort of blame Sharp not paying attention or something. But often it really probably was the people themselves being unclear. And all of this matters if you're doing a database and you've got to search for something. That's something that, a nettle that we've got to grasp, really. We've got no questions. Come on, people. Anybody got or comments? Otherwise, you get me rattling on.
What, the audio is on?
Yep, Richard's got his hand up.
Hang on, I don't know where the hand's going.
That's very interesting, Andy. I enjoyed that. You didn't say how Cecil Sharp managed to pick those places out of the map.
Well, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Oh, right. Okay.
I wish I did. I mean, I've been doing armchair research, although obviously from your armchair these days, you can get an awful lot of things you would have had to go to the archive previously to find. But, that's all I found in the notebook. I'm not aware of correspondence, but, I haven't been looking elsewhere for correspondence. No. Did he just turn up? No, why go to Trosley? He must surely have had a reason for going to Trosley. Either he was going to be in that area or someone had tipped him off. But no, I'm afraid I don't know. You can see why he went to the Royal Belvedere home, because he'd got a captive, well, not a captive audience, but, the captive population of seafarers who he could reasonably have suspected that would know some songs.
Yeah.
Thank you. Vic's got his hand up now.
Sheila actually wanted.
I just want to say, if you do anything with censuses, you're because it's someone going to the house on census day and taking down whatever somebody says to them, and with a name like mine, Corcoran, I can see it in spell in God knows how many ways in different censuses. It's not surprising. And I was also going to say about names of places. When we lived in Huddersfield, we had a lady. There was what's it called? Where Annie is Slathwaite.
Slathwaite.
No, yeah.
How you're supposed to say it. The locals call it Slowit, and I know someone who lived very close to there. She thought it was two different places.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You get that as well. I mean, I was interested in your Kent pronunciation. In Sussex, Westmeston is Wemster, and Brighthelmstone was the original name of Brighton and the original spelling. So that the name, the spelling and the pronunciation change over time.
Yeah. Well, and with Trosley, there is, even now, if you look on the maps, you'll find there's a Trosley Country Park. And I haven't spent any time sort of delving into, when this changed. But even in Sharp's time, if you look at the OS maps, it is spelt as Trottiscliffe. Yeah. But, both were probably in use.
When we moved to West Yorkshire, we went round to friends of ours to learn how to say all the local names.
Yeah.
Because it's not clear from seeing it written down. Yes. Plus in Sussex they say Ardingly and Ly's are lies, not Lees.
Yeah, but West Hoathly is West Hoathly, not West Hoathly. Yeah. Julia's asking, are there any clues about the children in Trosley? Is that where he collected the children's games?
That's where he collected the children's games, yes. And no, pretty much, I think it's just, it's a notation. They only appear in the folk tunes, even though one of them doesn't have as I recall, doesn't actually have a tune, but it's, that will be the rhymes and then a fairly brief representation of the game itself. I can't remember offhand whether I think I've looked at the folk at the field notebooks for that period and not seen anything, but I wouldn't absolutely swear to that, I have to admit.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy. We've run out of questions, so we're going to move on to Vic.
Right.
Talk about Dave Harker. Or we'll get Dave Harker talking about Vic Gammon, if you like.
Oh,
That'd be good
he's not
too.
here today, is he? This is interesting and significant. Let me just share my screen. Are you seeing anything there?
No, nothing.
Oh,
There we go. Yeah,
there we
we've
go,
got that.
right. So I just want full screen now. Is that okay?
Yeah, we've got that. Vic, your voice is fairly quiet.
I'll get nearer the microphone then and speak
Nearer
up.
or speak up, boy.
Yeah,
Speak up.
I'll turn the mic up a touch. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my old friend Dave Harker. I say it's significant he's not here today, but he's not been involved with the folk movement in either on the research side or the activity side hardly at all. This is one of the interesting things about him, but more about that later. So these are the materials I'm working with today. Dave Harker's published work, which is, we'll have a look later, it's extensive. I'm only going to deal with his published work on song, which is about half his output. He's written 5 books on the early Bolsheviks. He's written on Robert Tressel's The Ragged Trouser Philanthropists. He's written on the Flying Pickets, not the pop group, but actual trade unionists. I mean, it's quite wide. So one of his interests is song. And I've basically interviewed him earlier this year, thinking, we're both in our late 70s now, that we ought to really, try and sort of see how things settled out. And I found that I had 2 other recordings. One was a traditional song forum, which I know some of you were at in 2018 in Newcastle University, when I interviewed you in front of a pretty large audience. And that is a very good recording. If you want to listen to one statement of what he's about and his position, he's articulate, he's responding to the audience. It's rather good. So all these recordings are on Internet Archive. I have this thing which I lovingly call the Vic Gammon Audio Archive, and I've now put all 3 on. And you can, if you just go to the Internet Archive, put Vic Gammon in, you will see all the stuff that I've put up there. Also about 6 of David's books as well, which I put up. I persuaded him that to really, for the sake of posterity, he ought to not just have them in hard copy, but have them on the internet. So I did it for him. And then going right back to 1986, thanks to Doc Rowe, who can't be here today, but would have liked to be, he's somewhere filming something. The Ewan McColl Symposium, a rather interesting and strange event that occurred at County Hall in 1986, just as the GLC was coming to an end, because the Conservative government of Mrs. Thatcher had decided to destroy it as politically unsuitable or something. So it's also my personal knowledge and friendship with him. We both like Indian food. This is the real basis of our friendship, I think, that we have curries together. I've seen him probably 2-3 times a year in the last, sometimes less than that, for really since I think the McColl Symposium, where we ostensibly opposed each other in presentations, but actually that was the sort of thing that in some ways cemented our friendship. And my focus is on his published work. So there we go. Now, why is that not changing? Seem to not be able to. Next, let's do it this way then. Okay. So his background briefly: he's a grammar school boy from North Yorkshire. He goes to Cambridge as quite a young person, 18. Ends up doing research, works at Manchester Polytechnic, retires in the early 2000s, and has had a period of significant productivity since then. I came across him in the 70s at conferences, and as I say, I think this 86 meeting was the one where we really started being in touch with each other, you know, not closely, but over a long period. He lived in Newcastle in the early 70s, but mostly lived in Whaley Bridge near Manchester. He tried to move up to Newcastle in 2008, but that was a fortuitous year for finances and mortgages, and it failed. It says eventually moved 2025. No, that is a mistake. That's a typo. He eventually moved in 2015. So he's been in Newcastle for 5 years. I mean, he has 10 years, big one. I can't even count. He has a particular liking for Newcastle. I think partly it's his investment of research there. But his work has covered a wide range. I mentioned it earlier, about 20 books, half of them in song. He gave up writing articles in the 90s. I think my personal feeling is he got fed up with editors, but there we are. And there is a bibliography which I think that Steve has made available to you. So that's a sort of background. Okay, so the earliest work was this article which hit us in 1972, Cecil Sharp in Somerset, Some Conclusions, and you can hear the sort of echoes of Sharp's English folk song, Some Conclusions in that. It starts off with a brief biography. It picks up some factual faults, particularly Sharp's vagueness and imprecision. You know, I just read a little bit. Sharp he said he had collected 1,500 tunes, between 12 and 1,300 of these in Somerset, or more accurately, in about 2/3 of that county. More accurately still, he had in fact collected under 1450 tunes, only 1,282 of which were collected, even with a semblance of texts as songs. So Harker's background, his degree was in literature. He's not a musician. I mean, that doesn't obviously disqualify him from interest in this material, certainly not. But it's quite an interesting point to bear in mind. It's a pretty devastating critique in all sorts of ways. We see the middle section of the screen there. You see the last bit of it, and he lambasts Sharp for his nationalistic sentiments, his bourgeois values, I mean, this is quite interesting. There you have it, folk song as mediated by Cecil Sharp to be used as raw material or instrument, being extracted from a tiny fraction of the rural proletariat and to be imposed upon the town and country alike for the people's own good, not in its original form, but suitably integrated into the conservatoire curriculum, made the basis of nationalistic sentiments and bourgeois values. And he says, well, you know, in any case, the working people of England just rejected that anyway. So this is, you know, this is stringent stuff. 10 years later, I'm not quite sure what happens. I didn't know him in this period particularly well. There is another essay on Sharp, which covers some of the same material, but he uses a quote which has often been dragged out from Joseph Jacobs. Note there, folk is simply a name for our ignorance, which has a, you know, that's a good critical point, an interesting challenge to make. I mean, it's sort of stuff that Andy's doing in trying to see who these people were and what they did that really alleviates some of that ignorance. But the second quote is really interesting. This is in History Workshop Journal, which is a socialist historians magazine journal, and I just my screen is, oh, that's better. My screen was obscured. You note the second quote, a part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belongs economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the conditions of the working class, organisers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole in the corner reformers of every imaginable kind. Now, the absolutely erudite among you will recognise that quote. It's from the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Why it's not attributed to Marx and Engels, I have no idea, because, you know, he's no wish to, it's probably just a editorial oversight, to be honest, but he is framing Sharp within those members of the bourgeoisie desirous of redressing social grievances. So in a sense, he's setting up the whole thing, and he goes on to criticise Sharp in ways that a lot of people are familiar with. He did fall out with, I think, with the editors of History Workshop Journal, some of whom are friends of mine, because they lost 9 pages of this essay, seemingly, so it isn't quite complete. It covers similar ground to the first essay, but develops it further. It deals with Sharp's editing methods, the Board of Education, the conclusions. Sharp went on to, this is a quote, Sharp went on to elaborate what it pleased him to term a scientific definition of folk song, which he uses exclusively to denote the song which has been created by common people, in contradistinction to the song, popular or otherwise, which has been composed by the educated. At the end, he comes to the view that this term folk should not really be used because it's so laden with connotation and sort of mythologies and so on. That's a view I certainly shared when I wrote my thesis in the 1980s, early 1980s. It was called Popular Music in Rural Society, which the popular music specialists didn't like and nobody else really seemed to understand. So I think, like a lot of us, we've reverted to this term folk music because people sort of roughly know what you're talking about, and there we are. So he set his standards firmly up at this time. In the 1980s, he produces 2 books. One for the money, which comes out of his teaching of general studies at Manchester Polytechnic. He's teaching apprentices and so on. And the one thing he found common ground on was to deal with pop music. It has some really quite interesting things in. I think it's a book that he discards it as a book that's not worth reading anymore. But I think some of it is actually rather good. But there are critiques of particularly Bert Lloyd, Ewan McColl and Peggy Seeger and the Radio Ballad and stuff like that. There's actually a chapter called Fakesong, and of course, this 5 years later, it becomes this more full-blown book, which again is available on the internet. That's the first thing. It was selling, it's quite interesting, it was selling at like over £1,000 a copy because it was so rare. Dave didn't like this. I said, well, stick it, make it public property, stick it on the internet. He didn't. He's strange with computers. I mean, one of the reasons he's perhaps not with us here today is that he doesn't have sound on his computer, for example, and yet he writes all this stuff. It's a sort of, I don't want to be unkind about him, but he has his own way of dealing with things. Anyway, I want to play you one of the things in both books is a critique of Bert Lloyd, and I'd like to play you some of this is from, I think, the recent interview I did with him. So have a listen to this. Well, I mean, you must have encountered Bert Lloyd around this time.
Never met him.
You never met him. You
No.
corresponded with him, and
I did.
and you started to find. I mean, you're one of the first people who really starts to find problems with some of his
Yes.
texts and publications.
Better still, he admitted there were problems when I
Yeah.
wrote to him.
Yeah.
And I gave those letters to the guy who was writing his life. Never used them.
Never used them. Well, yeah.
Anyway, I found that out when I was working on the thesis, because I had to go to Liverpool, Picton Library, and there was a collection of slip songs. I think they're all slip songs, actually. I had to go to Wigan because there's some there, and they're all being taken down there by a bell, some relation to John, not John. John was long dead, obviously, at that point. But he infected all of his relations, as far as I can make out. And I couldn't understand.
Oh, God. Sorry about that. Well, I mean, you must have encountered Bert Lloyd.
Come all ye bold miners after there, and they're all being taken down there by a bell, some relation to John, not John. John was long dead, obviously, at that point. But he infected all of his relations, as far as I can make out. And I couldn't understand come all ye bold miners after that.
Yeah.
You know.
Because of the emendations and fabrications.
I was a deep admirer of Bert's writing.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, who wasn't? Who wasn't?
Similar position, yeah.
And it was hurtful. Yeah. So I wrote him this ever so gentle letter. It might be in Goldsmith still, for all I know.
Yeah, I had a look at his stuff in Goldsmith, but it was all unsorted at the time I was there. So
there probably is a lot of it.
There's a fair bit of it.
I thought there would be.
Yeah.
And he wrote these letters back and saying, looking back, it wasn't a very scholarly way to behave, which is an understatement. Yeah. And from that, of course, came the book about the Miners' Songs later in
which was a real achievement, that book of the Miners' Songs. I mean,
people tell me that.
It's not very well known. Well, okay, so by this time, I had decided that I really ought to respond in certain ways. Not that I disagreed with everything he said, but I disagreed with aspects of his approach and some of the things that were being said, and his sort of. I suppose I didn't like his combative style. This is the beginning of my article with a rather facetious illustration of Karl Marx playing a balalaika. And I've reviewed the writing, particularly the two books, and this all happened this was going to be published in March 1986, and I was in touch with Carl Dallas at that time, and he said, well, we ought to have you at this Ewan McCull event that's coming off, debating with Harker. So I said, well, that's all right if you could fix it up. So that is what we decided to do. And so the debate actually took place before this article came out, although of course I had it was the same month. I think I had prepared it and so on already. So this is a nice picture of us too at the McCull Symposium. I didn't know this picture existed until a few days ago, and Doc Rowe kindly sent it to me. And I want to play you two of the responses. I made a sort of long statement based on that article, and then Dave responded, I think in a very, I think he was fairly nervous at this situation for someone who's so outspoken. I want to play you two of the responses that came after we had both spoken, because you can hear the whole thing. As I say, you can go to this Internet Archive website and hear there's an hour-long session with the two of us speaking. But this is first of all Carl Dallas responding to Harker's presentation. Here we go.
I'm very disappointed with Dave Harker. Because a critical analysis of the failings, the romanticism, the sentimentality, the falsehoods that abound in the folk revival is absolutely essential if we are to understand what has happened, what has gone wrong, what potential now exists for us to put that right. I'm afraid I see Dave, I'm sure this isn't really, I don't think he's got any CIA money or anything behind him. I see him occupying a classic Trotskyist position, where where there is cause for criticism, a over-the-top, poorly expressed, and often downright inaccurate analysis in quasi-revolutionary terms is put forward, which provokes a mass response from people who say, but that's nonsense. And that devalues the actual criticism which is still required.
Nice, I think. That's an interesting statement. This is a sort of pro Dave Harker statement by Ken Hyder. Now he's a very interesting guy. I only met him the once, but I actually went that evening to his performance by his band in Islington, and he was a jazz musician who was also interested in traditional music as well. And this is Ken Hyder stating the contrary view.
Ken Hyder. I want to take a very unpopular line in supporting what Dave is saying in some sort of essence, because I think that although he overstates the case, I think that there's a certain truth in what he's saying about the marginal sense of culture. And it was something that came up yesterday in the truncated discussion that we had in the morning. And it seems to me that an awful lot of people within the folk movement have an idealized view of the importance of folk music to the people that they would seek to have folk music be an important part of their culture. And I think that what Dave's done and what his book has done is punctured an awful lot of the myths surrounding the folk scene that are perpetuated by the people who are involved, who are taking a bourgeois look at the music as an idealized kind of thing, where there are a set of assumptions about it.
In some ways, it was a strange meeting. It was a bit like some different leftist factions discussing with each other, some interesting contributions. The outstanding one, which I don't have time to play, was by Norman Buchan MP, who became lovely man. You probably know him through 101 Scottish Songs, but he became a Labour MP and also the Minister of Culture for a time in a Labour government. So I think this event really was the moment of change in some ways, because I think Harker, there is this interesting.
Ken
Sorry.
Hyder.
I'm very
Sorry.
I want to take.
I can't seem to control the switch of the. Oh, there we are. Sorry about that. He produces in '85, which is the year before we have this discussion, this songs from the manuscript of John Bell. Now, John Bell is a fascinating character. I think Harker maybe has three heroes in the world. One of them is John Bell. Another one is one of the Tyneside singers I'll talk about later, and the third one is Leon Trotsky. Bell was a fascinating collector. He worked in the early 19th century, and he was interested in everything, including amassing quite a wonderful collection of song texts and some tunes from oral sources. Now, this is 100 years or so before Sharp, for example. And so produced by the Surtees Society, which is a sort of learned society that existed since the 1830s. In Durham, and they produced, basically a society of record that produces historical documents. Dave didn't like the conventions that were placed on him, the editing conventions, but he went along with them. They're still, I think, two of the most interesting pieces of work that have come out of folk revival scholarship, certainly critical editions. The first one, and in fact the second one, was produced with the assistance of Frank Rutherford, who I have a very odd connection with. I inherited some of his books because I knew his daughter. I never met him, but he was a librarian at Durham University and interested in this field, and a friend of the folk club at Berkeley, the Elliot family, and so on. And I do think these are rather outstanding works, which ought to be much better known. I'll let you hear a bit on this material, a short extract. When did you sort of fall in love with Newcastle and the North-East? Why did you come to to want to specialise and produce so much stuff on the North-East singers and songwriters? It's that sort of idea of an entry into working class culture, is it?
Two things. One is you haven't been to Middlesbrough lately. And the second thing is it's so rich. It's fantastically rich. What I can't understand is why this kind of material isn't available as much elsewhere. And there's a single question answer to that, and it's John Bell is the answer to that question, because he infected his relations with this kind of thing, yeah? And he collected stuff. And he tried to sell his collections. I think there was 43 huge books like Bell White 3 with bits pasted in, yeah, to the Bodleian. The Bodleian turned them down because they're stupid. Or were stupid. And now for the miners' songs I had to go to the obvious place, Liverpool. That's where they were, yeah? And it gets worse because there's a kind of a print diaspora as well. When I was doing, Pete mentioned the George Ridley booklet, because the web had been invented, I could find the copy of the second little pamphlet that was produced. Not the obvious place, the National Library of Australia. And when I was doing the Ned Corvin book, I just Googled Ned Corvin because it's quite an unusual name, and I found another printing of Ned's songs in Sunderland in 1854, and that was in the Bodleian. Isn't it strange, yeah? Where this stuff's gone to over the years, it's been spread out. But still, I mean, the collection here, I think it's been beginning to be digitised, and I hope it is, and I mentioned this to Steve earlier on, that it ought to be generally available because it's priceless. Most of that was collected by John Bell, but it's called the Robert White collection because Robert White bought it, basically, yeah? And it's really unfair that John Bell doesn't get the credit for it.
In some ways, the songs and verse of the North-East Pitmen, which is historically rooted in miners' publications, broadsheets and so on, is sort of an answer to Bert Lloyd's Come All Ye Bold Miners. It's historically contextualised, scrupulously edited, notes follow each text, a number of which contain criticisms of Lloyd and the way that he did Come All Ye Bold Miners. It's full of fascinating stuff. There is no music, but you can hear from the tenaciousness of his ability to follow sources. I mean, I find it hard to get off my backside and go to Newcastle to look at some sources with the internet giving us so much riches. But Dave has really followed this stuff. He makes a statement at the end of in the Songs and Verse of the North-East Pitmen, which is quite a late, it took some time to come to fruition. And I'd like to read that because it really sort of sums up his perspective in some ways. Some interpretation is unavoidable, and since no historian or editor is innocent, all that can be done here is to make the writer's perspective and methods as transparent and hopefully as consistent and self-reflexive as possible. The tradition at work here is that of classical Marxism, as outlined in Kalinikos, The Revenge of History, a perspective which is not, of course, to be mistaken for the Stalinist distortion which caused so much confusion during the Cold War, and which sadly still does in some sheltered and unscholarly quarters. So he still has this sort of, battling sort of idea. But the emphasis of the work has changed from, just lambasting sort of various figures to a much more scholarly investigation of the sources. Now, this is when I tend to come on the scene. 2012 was the 150th anniversary of the Bladen races in 1862. It was on a summer's day. Dave was asked to write a book to commemorate this, and he'd done a lot of the work. He'd already published stuff in the 70s on North-East songwriters, but this edition of three items: the book on the left, the CD in the middle, which I produced, but has 5 pretty exceptional North-East singers: Terry Conway, Benny Graham, Johnny Handel, Jim McGeehan and Brian Watson, and also a DVD, a sort of dramatized version of the life of George Ridley. Let's hear a bit about Ridley, because he's an interesting character, and this again is from the TSF meeting, I think. Well, Ridley is an interesting singer, isn't he? There's not much material. It's two really famous songs, Blatant Races and Cushy Butterfield, but actually it's quite meagre compared with other people, isn't it? The amount of material there is.
Not only that, those songs were not popular when he was alive. They became popular later in the century.
It's a really interesting story, isn't it, how they come through to the present day.
Yeah, a man called J.C. Scatter, that was his stage name, a guy from Gateshead, we think. Goes on the stage as a musical artist. In the 1890s, he starts singing Blatant Races. And then something very strange happened a few years later. Newcastle United won something, and they won it more than once. And as you could have heard today, it caught on, yeah? They know only half the chorus, but they know the half the chorus quite well. So really, I mean, it's like lots of things. I mean, Blatant Races was written for a benefit for a world champion rower, which nobody's heard about, Harry Clasper.
Well,
and this is where,
play.
Yeah, this is where Ed Woff, the playwright,
I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah, which I shall leave till later, I think.
Okay, so Ridley, although he comes through as having written these now two most famous Geordie songs, in fact, I mean, he sort of pales into insignificance against the others. So, I mean, if you look at, I mean, I know you have ambiguous feelings about Wilson, we'll talk about him in a minute, Joe Wilson, but it's a big book, the Joe Wilson songs. We've got 127 of Ned Corvin songs, something like that, you know. So it really is, you know, it's a case of someone being sort of bigged up by history and almost chance in a way, isn't it?
Who? Which one?
I'm talking about Ridley.
Ridley. Well, Ridley starts off singing Irish songs, that's what he called them. And the reason he had to do that was because he got run over by a coal wagon he was trying to drive. Just opposite, near the Sage, in fact. It was coming down to the river to a quay there, to load a collier, seagoing collier. And I'm not sure what happened to him, and you know, it wasn't even in the newspapers. That's how common that kind of industrial accident was. And he spent a year in bed, and he had to earn a living, and he could sing, so he sang that. And eventually he started writing his own. He didn't write, well, if he wrote many, we don't know. And if we don't know them, that's because Thomas Allen, the publisher, never published them, yeah? We just don't know. He could have written dozens and hundreds. He didn't travel far. He didn't go beyond the Tyne Valley, this end of the Tyne Valley, as far as I can tell. And he was forgotten about as soon as he died at the age of 29.
They all died young.
29. Can you imagine? So that's Ridley, really.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's, I mean, important in certain respects because his songs have survived. I mean, at least
two of them have.
The voice and the chorus of two of them have. Some interesting background, and you can really hear from that the way he's inhabited the sources. Okay, so this leads to Harker producing a series of books which really document a lot of the popular musical tradition of Tyneside and the North-East generally. The book on Ned Corvin, the Catgut Jim. Ned Corvin was fascinating. He relates to Billy Purvis, the someone describes as the first professional Geordie, although he was in fact a Scotsman who lived in Tyneside, lived in Hexham where I lived for a time. A book on Joe Wilson, who as I say, he Harker has a mixed view on Joe Wilson, but it doesn't stop the book being interesting. A couple of more general books, Tyneside Song, Blind Willie to Bobby Nunn, that's the earlier singers of the part of the century down to the 1840s, 50s, when the Tyneside musical really... And then a more overarching book, The Northern Minstrels, which tries to... I told him it was impossible to write such a book, so, you know, that was enough to set him off and write it. But the interesting thing about these books, and they're all on the website I told you about now, as well as you can, if you get in touch with Dave, he's got some copies left. They are very nicely produced in heavy paper because they are full of contemporary illustrations, broadsides, pictures, songbooks, all sorts of stuff. I mean, they're also anthologies as well as being books about the particular people or groups of people involved. But I think it marked a real style change in his way of writing. And then I asked him about this in the latest interview, and this is what he said. I detect, though, I mean, when we think about this great set of books that you've self-published on the Tyneside singer-songwriters, you know, Joe Wilson, Ned Corford.
9 of them now.
9 of them. I mean, I don't think they're well known enough, firstly. I think they're
doing my best.
I think they're extraordinarily interesting in the way that you've used the sources and you present so much. But I do think I want you to comment on the change in the style between, say, Fakesong and what you're doing now. It seems to me that what you're doing now is much more empirical, much more putting it over to the reader to make sense of the material.
The change was, who wants to know my opinion?
It's very modest, really. I mean, if I said Dave Harker is so modest, people would sort of laugh at me. But I mean, that's
well, they haven't met me then, have
no,
they?
they haven't. They haven't. I think this is one of the things I'm trying to do with this. You see, I want them to at least engage with you a bit.
I get accused of being too modest by people up here and all over. Yeah. Only people who know me.
Yeah, interesting.
I don't regard it as modesty. I just think it's my job, as it were. It was me paid.
Oh, there you are. Modest indeed. Okay, so I think it's worth summing up, and I've actually set this down. I mean, to me, the Marxist language of the Marist, oh God, that's a typing error. My eyes are going, and I do make quite a lot of typing errors. The Marxist language of the early works doesn't always communicate that well to a wider audience. I mean, the trouble with that adversarial language is not necessarily the ideas behind it. I mean, I share some of them, but the way it just sort of cuts off. I mean, Carl Dallas almost got it right there, that it sort of blocks off the audience. It becomes a barrier. You know, and the book on the collector's Fakesong, if you put it through a sort of sausage machine that's you know, that judges all the collectors against some perfect standard, they are all going to fail, and that's what they do right the way through from the early ones to the later ones. I think the later work has really done something quite amazing. It's drawn attention to the fascinating richness of Tyneside and North-East songs. When he came to Tyneside, I mean, he'd looked at Sharp's stuff in the southwest. He also interestingly looked at Sharp's the broadside barriers ballads made in the southwest area, particularly in Somerset, and seen the connections which Sharp had, you know, not done in his pioneering way. He wasn't a Frank Kidson. He didn't look at the broadsides particularly much, but he realised. I mean, he came across what he thinks is about 5,000 song texts in the North-East. Now that is bigger than Sharp's collection by a considerable way. So there was all this material, and this we have to tell people about this richness because they don't believe it otherwise. So it raises serious questions about other places and other song cultures. You know, we know the Bothy ballads in Aberdeenshire. We know a bit about sort of local song in some other places. But it seemed to me that drawing attention to this richness of local song, which may have survived by a sort of fluke of particular people's interest and accidents, it is an important thing that comes out of his work. There's also the point that it's really the port of call for any new researcher to the field. I mean, you know, whether you like, these books are a strange combination of narrative, history, facsimile source material, photographs, illustrations, advertisements, playbills, song sheets, songbooks. They're also an anthology because lots of the songs are just there in full, you know, Corvin songs and so on. So they're rich in themselves, but they're also quite a definitive guide to any future researchers on the subject. Now, I don't think in studying any sort of history, interpretation can be avoided. You know, I think whether it's Dave's particular Marxist approach or the sort of more sort of liberal leftist approach that I take, whatever, nobody can go to the past without questions in their mind, without preconceptions, without, you know, something that makes them interpret in certain ways. We can't free ourselves from being human, basically. But it's quite interesting. As I said, he'd written on all this other stuff, and I wanted to know from him what was the unifying point of his work. You know, when you think of Robert Tressel, the Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, the Flying Pickets, the early Bolsheviks, and so on. This is what he said. But I mean, it's impressive. I mean, I don't know this side of your work anywhere near so much as I know the other stuff. I know, but I've only got one lifetime. But you know, I mean, it just seems wonderful. What's the relationship between these different things? I mean, you've got the song stuff, you've got the
workers.
Right, okay.
Workers.
Just expand that.
What was it like being a worker then there?
So that's the keystone to Harker's output.
An attempt to look up rather than look down.
Right. So it's history from below, looking at sources.
In spite of the sources, yeah?
Yeah. So history from below in spite of the sources. You can never, he said to me at another time, you can never really get to it, but you can get close through the right material. So to conclude with, I mean, this is a sort of sales pitch in a way. Is Harker worth reading? I absolutely think so. But as with any writer, be that Ritson or Child or Steve Roud or Arthur Nevitt, whoever, you have to read critically. You can't just accept it. You've got to do the job and read the thing critically. But I do think there's a lot of value in Harker's work, in spite of the difficulty of some areas of it. So thanks very much for your attention. And back to you, Steve.
Wow, thank you, Vic. That was splendid. And to be honest, we need more things like this. We need to document our own generation. We need to, you know, get under the skin of it. So I very much appreciate what you just did, and I could take a lot more of it, but not necessarily now. Has anybody got any comments or questions? I mean, one thing I would say, just to start the ball rolling, you're right about the recent books on the North-East songs and stuff. They are absolutely gold. They are gold mines. They are wonderfully researched, but they are absolutely frustrating in that they are unedited. They are just, I mean, you mentioned the fact that he had trouble with editors over the years, which I can understand perfectly. But the kind of thing that he's given us is, you know, whatever he's got, he's thrown it in the book.
Yeah.
Mind dump.
It doesn't make it easy to read or to digest. So again, it's sort of extremes. You know, if you're not careful, you go to the far extreme and you lose what you had earlier on. Anyway,
I started off, I just responded, I started off reading his stuff in advance, but he took no notice of the stuff I said, so I gave up on it and, you know, just let him get on with it. Yes, they're badly edited. Some of the references aren't that good. Some of it, you know, it jumps from point to point, but there is a massive, interesting information in there if you want to go for it.
Oh, yeah, undoubtedly. Yes. Yeah. Liz, you got your hand up? You've got to unmute.
And okay, I had one question really. When I was in Newcastle, I went to Lytton Phil, and it's a very beautiful library, and I'm hoping there's a lot of material there that relates to this. Can anyone comment on whether that's a good collection to go back and look at?
It's a good collection in terms of the mining industry. They have the Miners Institute there. It's got some interesting stuff, but it didn't have, I mean, the real interesting miners song stuff that Harker found was, as he said, in Liverpool, not in, you know, no one library has everything. And you know, the Lytton Phil is wonderful. It's worth a visit from anybody, and the Miners Institute next door. I've actually did a concert with Benny Graham in the Miners Institute. They have this wonderful lecture theatre that's a bit like the old
dissection.
Yeah, the old surgeons sort of, you know, teaching classes, and the audience are sort of in front of you and above you, and both buildings, they're both interesting comments on the radicalism of Newcastle and the way they created institutions like that. But I don't think you'll find, if Harker hasn't found it, I mean, he does have this bulldog approach to finding the stuff, which is one of the things I admire in him. But I don't think you'll find it. You'll spend a lifetime of interest in the Lytton Phil, but you won't necessarily find a lot on this. There's some, there's some in most libraries, but to find this broad mass of material, not there particularly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But no other questions yet. One of the problems, Vic, I've got with the Pitmen book, which I haven't looked at for a long time, Songs of the North-East Pitmen, and I have this trouble with all books about mining, is that implies that miners sang nothing but songs about mines.
Yeah.
Did they not sing Barbara Allen? And
of course I did.
And so on. And this is what worries me. It's songs about mining that miners sang. Rather
I always think Songs the Whaleman sang is the great, that has editing problems, but it's also a wonderful illustration of the width and breadth of general repertories. No, I mean he wanted, this is part of his approach. He wanted to concentrate on that stuff. I think it's very much a response to Lloyd. I mean, he's sort of saying this is how Lloyd should have done it. Well, I don't, Lloyd didn't do it that way. He set up this contest in the National Union of Mine Workers and collected what was there. I mean, the worst aspects of Lloyd is the way he fiddled with stuff, and he sort of admits this in letters to Dave. I mean, I've seen some of this, and it's a shame because we all looked up to him enormously in those early days, and I when I was at the Newcastle event, I said I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't to Bert Lloyd, and I think that was because he created the interest that became a lifetime of looking at this stuff, and finding out about it.
Who's got a hand up, sir?
Well, it's just what I asked in the comments, which you obviously haven't seen. I just asked, would Vic like to comment on the legacy of Fakesong from the imagined village onwards, Ross Cole, and popular depictions of Sharp?
I mean, Cole is rip-off Dave Harker. Let's put that frankly and directly. I was at a conference on Scotland musically and something, and he gave this presentation. I said, well, what's different between what you're saying and what Dave Harker said 30 years ago? And he sort of didn't have an answer, really. I mean, it was quite embarrassing. I felt sorry for the bloke. No, I didn't really. I think, he's taken it to another level. I mean, this idea that Sharp, I mean, Dave, there have been various good critiques of him. I mean, I don't want to be libelous, but I don't think he's a scholar to be taken seriously. Whereas I think in some ways Harker is. I think there's a difference between Harker's gone to the sources. I'm not sure Cole has. What Harker hasn't done and can't do, and I think is part of the richness, say, of Sharp, is the musical sources. I think Sharp, we are infinitely richer having Sharp's collection with all its problems. The problems I've dealt in an essay with the problems of the notation in Sharp, but I still think I'd rather have Sharp than not have Sharp because he's added an enormous amount to our knowledge and understanding of the stuff.
Fine. Anybody else? Sorry, Sue, did you?
Julia's put a comments in the chat.
Yes, I haven't. I can't multitask.
No.
I'm a bloke.
Right, Julia says.
You should ask it. It's okay. I just didn't want to interrupt the conversation. So, but yeah, Vic, you alluded earlier to Dave, not having a musical background particularly, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment on what impact you think that might have had on his work. Or how it would have changed his work if he had, and also if he himself commented on that ever in your
No,
conversations?
he comments on tunes a bit. Like a lot of the Tyneside writers write to other to pre-existing tunes. That was so common in 18th and 19th century. You wrote songwriting was mostly to tunes that already existed. But I do think that song is a complex thing. It's a text that is sung to a tune, unified in performance, and you never get to the ideal. And you can, I mean, as David Atkinson has said, you can look at the texts and derive things from them. I don't think you ever achieve that unity of understanding. I mean, God bless Harker in a way. I mean, no, we're both atheists, but I mean, it was through doing the work on the George Ridley record that I discovered that that great Geordie song, Gan into Bladen Races on the 9th of June, was actually an American tune. And, I started to look at the richness of the contribution of blackface minstrelsy to the sort of songs being produced in Tyneside in the 1850s and 60s, and that is really interesting. And I shared that with Dave, and it's there in some of his books, but I don't think there's any there can't be a depth to the understanding of the musicality of the idiom, because that's not what he does, and I respect that, because you can come at the stuff from different ways, but it can still be an absence from the total picture. I mean, he does express his wonderful bit in what, the interviews are there. No, it's a 3 hour plus worth of stuff. If you've got to want to listen to it, but he does express wonder at the way in which singers like Wilson and so on were able to sing. The Tyneside Music Hall was up near the central station, and it was a wooden sort of wigwamish type building, and housed 2,000 people, and they sang in there without amplification. That is something to get your mind round, how that sort of communication could take place. And people joined in the choruses, so we know that they were hearing the words. Oh, yeah, and there were song sheets and little song books and so on as well. But it was nevertheless something like something pretty interesting that was going on. Audience behaviour changes over time, and then they perhaps did listen to the words.
I think we've probably got room for one more question from Martin.
Hi, Vic. I wonder whether you've got any insight into Dave Harker's reactions to Chris Behrman's criticisms.
He wrote a response to Behrman. He said Behrman makes loads of mistakes and points them out at great length. I haven't investigated that particularly. I mean, Behrman I always found quite. I mean, I tried to get on with him, but in his thesis he says that Harker is Satan and I am Beelzebub. So it didn't. I remember the 1998 conference, the 100 Years of the Folksong Society. I mean, I thought Behrman was important in that he'd done significant historical work on the Folksong Society, and and of course he had this speech impediment, which made it difficult and was very frustrating for him. And I said, look, I'll read your paper. I won't comment on it at all. I will read your paper. But he wouldn't have it. He got one of his tutors from Hull University to do it. So he was, they were both. I mean, I did it in one of the interviews suggest, we ought to have got you two together. And then I immediately thought, no, that would have been a disaster to get them to. It's worth reading both the Behrman article on the demography. I mean, I think that Behrman's article on the demography, on the people, is just misleading. He doesn't, I don't think these people. It depends what you mean by working class. You see, is class to do with consciousness or social position? These are much debated in leftist circles. I don't think, in terms of social position, I think a lot of most of Sharp's informants were working class. I mean, they probably, if anything, they might be vaguely radical liberals, but I don't think they were much else. And they certainly weren't militant socialists like Harker. That doesn't really answer your question, but no, there is a response article, so that's worth looking at if you want to follow it up. It's not what I was trying to do in this bit of work.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, thank you.
Well, Vic, now that you say that Fakesong is available online, something I've always wanted to do was to count how many times he uses the word bourgeois or bourgeoisie, because it seems to be his favourite word. I think it's on every page, sometimes twice. So I think that sort of sums it up as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for the presentation, and thanks for the commentary. And as I say, we really do need more things like this, where we're really getting under the skin of what people are doing, what our generation are doing and have done. Otherwise, we leave it to the next buggers, and they're going to get it wrong. So it's up to us to get it right and tell people what we really think. Anyway, thanks also to Andy for his Cecil Sharp bit. We will see you again in the autumn, won't we? September the 7th.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Bye, everybody.